The morning Sloane Avery broke the record. She almost didn't go. She had stood in her kitchen at 5:40 in the morning with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, staring at her father's jacket hanging on the back of the chair where she had put it 4 years ago and never moved. The canvas was dark green, worn soft at the elbows, and it still smelled, impossibly, stubbornly, like gun oil and dry Texas air. She had told herself 100 times in 4 years that she should wash it. She never had. The rifle cases were already in the trunk. She had loaded them the night before, around midnight, after driving to the storage unit in El Cajon, and standing in the fluorescent light for 20 minutes before she could make herself open the door. She had not been back since the week after the funeral. The cases were heavier than she remembered, or she was older than she used to be, or both. She picked up the jacket and put it on. She left the coffee on the counter. She drove south on the 5 as the sky went from black to the particular shade of gray that belongs only to the California coastline before sunrise. The transmission shuddered every time she downshifted. She had been meaning to fix it for 8 months. The radio stayed off. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her eyes straight ahead and her mind in a place that was not the road. Lily had still been asleep when she left. 17 years old, cross-country practice on Saturday mornings, 4 AP classes, the kind of focused, quiet intelligence that makes a parent simultaneously proud and frightened. Sloane had stood in the doorway of her daughter's room for a moment in the dark, just long enough to hear her breathing, and then she had walked to the car without turning the lights on in the hallway. She did not know how to explain where she was going. She barely knew how to explain it to herself. The challenge had happened 2 nights ago at the bar in Coronado. She had been working her Thursday shift, pouring drinks, listening to the particular brand of loud certainty that fills a room when a group of men who are very good at something talk about being very good at something. Derek Holt was at the far end of the bar with 6 other members of his team. He was not a small man, and he was not a quiet man. And for 15 years, he had held a long-range precision record in naval special warfare that had become something closer to mythology than statistics. She had heard him say the number, 2,478 yards, the way you say a number when you have said it many times and enjoy saying it. She had not meant to speak. The words had come out the way certain things come out when you have been holding them too long and something breaks loose without permission. My father shot farther. The bar had gone quiet in a specific kind of way. Holt had looked at her with the flat, assessing attention of a man deciding in under a second whether something required his full response or could be processed and dismissed. The dismissal had been in his eyes before he said a word. The challenge had been made before she finished her shift. $50,000, Saturday morning, Camp Pendleton Precision Range. She had said yes the way her father had always told her to commit to a shot, completely, without leaving yourself a way out, because the way out is where doubt lives. The sun was fully up by the time she turned onto the base road. She could see the range from the parking lot entrance, and she could see, even from that distance, that there were more people than she had expected. Many more. She parked. She sat for a moment with her hands still on the wheel. Then she got out and opened the trunk. 31 men. That was the number she counted as she walked through the range entrance with a rifle case in each hand. They had arranged themselves along the observation area with the particular energy of people who have decided that whatever is about to happen is worth giving their full attention to. Some had spotting scopes. Several had their phones out already. One man was eating a sandwich with the focused tranquility of someone who had seen enough of these situations to know that calories were a practical matter. She recognized the way they were looking at her. She had seen that look once before, on her father's face, the first time he brought her to the range in West Texas when she was 10 years old and stood behind her and waited to see what she would do. It was the look of someone who believed something completely and was standing in the presence of a variable they had not accounted for. They had not accounted for her. Holt was already there. He stood at the bench area with three other men and watched her set the cases down with the careful attention of someone updating information he thought he already had. "We're not starting with your equipment," he said. "I have a Macmillan TAC 338 set up at bench 3. My choice of rifle. Levels the field." She looked at him. "You're worried I have an advantage with my own gun. I'm ensuring no one can credit the equipment if you succeed. And if I fail?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then we have a different conversation." She looked at the Macmillan, military grade, Night Force scope properly mounted, suppressor, bipod, everything correctly fitted. A serious piece of equipment used by serious people. She had shot similar configurations at her father's range in Texas. Not identical, but close enough that the differences could be learned in 90 seconds of adjustment. "Fine," she said. She moved to bench 3. She adjusted the bipod by 2 millimeters, and then she did nothing for 90 seconds, except look through the scope at the wind flags positioned at 300, 600, and 1,000 yards along the range. She was not buying time. She was reading. "She's reading the wind," said someone behind her. "She's stalling," said someone else. "Easterly at 8 miles per hour, consistent. Coastal humidity at 70%. Temperature 64 degrees and climbing with the morning." At 1,000 yards, a 300-grain bullet would spend just over a second in the air. The 8-mile-per-hour crosswind would push it 9 inches left. She needed 29 minutes of angle elevation for the air density. She counted the scope clicks without making a sound. "Use the calculator," Holt said. It was sitting on the bench beside her. She didn't look up. "I don't need it. Standard protocol on this range." "I know what standard protocol is," she said. "My father didn't use one. I don't use one. If you want to disqualify me for that, go ahead. Otherwise, let me shoot." The silence behind her had a particular texture. 30 people holding their breath in the same moment makes a sound that is not quite silence, but is the closest thing to it. She shot. The steel plate at 1,000 yards rang like something struck in a church. Not near center, not approximately center. The kind of impact that left no room for interpretation. Dead center. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. Then a man at the back of the group said a single, quiet word that was not a word so much as a sound. The sound a person makes when something they were certain about has just been revised without their permission. "Again," Holt said. His voice had not changed, the voice of a man still fully in command of himself. But Sloane had been reading faces across a bar counter for 2 years, and she heard what lived underneath the flatness. She shot again. "Half an inch variance. Same spot. 1,500 yards, Holt said. She adjusted. She read the wind again, which had shifted 2 degrees in the last 4 minutes, freshening slightly toward the sea. She made the corrections. She fired twice. Both hits, center mass on a steel plate at 1,500 yards. The man with the sandwich had stopped eating. 2,000 yards was where they all expected it to end. She could feel that expectation in the quality of the silence. 2,000 yards was where the invisible forces began to accumulate. Wind, humidity, the rotation of the earth itself. Into margins that most trained shooters, with all the right equipment and all the right conditions, started to lose. Most trained shooters. She spent 4 minutes watching the wind flags before she fired. 4 minutes is a long time to do nothing visible. She could hear someone shifting their weight, someone clearing their throat with the careful quietness of a person who doesn't want to be the one who broke the silence. She was watching the grass at the base of the 2,000-yard stand, the way it moved differently from the grass at 1,500. A slight additional pressure, wind picking up speed as it channeled between 2 low hills she had noted on the drive in. She made adjustments she did not explain out loud. She fired. The sound came back from 2,000 yards after nearly 2.5 seconds. Clean, unmistakable, center mass. 3 men behind her spoke at the same time and immediately stopped, each yielding to the silence that felt more important than anything they had to say. The tall man who had made the comment about this being fast When she first walked in, lowered his spotting scope, and stood with his arms at his sides, and his face doing something she recognized. The recalibration of someone revising a belief they had held for a long time. Center, the second spotter said. The word came out clinical, flat, like a weather report. Holt stood very still. Then he said, 2,500 yards. Sloan set down the Macmillan. I'll need my rifle for that distance. The conditions of the challenge. The conditions covered standard competition distances, she said. 2,500 yards is not a standard competition distance. There is no standard for that distance. We are in different territory now, and I am not going to attempt to break a record you've held for 15 years with a rifle I've been shooting for 90 minutes. She looked at him directly. She did not soften it. I'll use the Barrett from my case. Or we stop here and call it whatever you want to call it. The pause that followed had a different quality than the earlier silences. This was the pause of a man navigating something in front of an audience, something that did not have a clean answer. Behind him, several of his men had the careful, neutral faces of people watching their commanding officer in a moment that required him to decide who he was. Use your rifle, Holt said. She pulled the Barrett M107A1 from its case and felt something move through her that she could not have described accurately to another person. The weight of it, the specific geometry of how it settled against her shoulder and along her cheek. Her father's modifications, the custom trigger shoe, the repositioned cheek weld, the scope mount 2 millimeters lower than factory specification because he had once told her that factory specification was designed by someone who had never actually used one in the field. She had been shooting this rifle since she was 19 years old. She set up at bench 3 and found the scope and looked downrange at the steel plate Holt had specified. At 25 yards, it was smaller than a dinner plate. Through the scope at that distance, it was smaller than the head of a thumbtack held at arm's length. Technically visible, technically hittable. In practical terms, it was a shot fewer than a dozen people alive had ever made in documented competition conditions. The wind had been shifting for the last 6 minutes, southwest at 11 miles per hour, then swinging north, then dying, then surging back to 14. The flags at 500-yard intervals along the range gave her 5 different readings simultaneously. The heat coming off the desert floor had begun to twist the distant target into something wavering and uncertain. She did not touch the ballistic calculator. She did not touch the Kestrel weather meter. She watched the grass. She's just lying there, one of the men muttered, not mocking, genuinely uncertain about what he was looking at. She's computing everything, said a quiet voice to his left. It belonged to a man who had been watching Sloan with a different quality of attention than the others for the past 2 hours. Older, lean, standing against the far wall with a stillness that was different in kind from the trained stillness of the men around him. Less practiced, more natural, like someone who had learned to be still not through discipline, but through decades of simply needing to be. She's just not doing it with a machine. Sloan heard neither of them. She was watching a strip of dried yellow grass at the 800-yard mark. The way it bent said one thing. The flag at 1200 said something slightly different. A compound angle, a secondary wind source feeding in from behind the low hills to the north. The faint shimmer in the air at 2,000 yards, visible only to someone who had learned to read the language of heat and moving atmosphere, said a third thing entirely. Her father had spent the better part of her childhood teaching her to read all 3 at once. The way a sailor reads water and sky and rope simultaneously without consciously attending to any individual one of them. It had taken years. It had taken cold mornings and missed shots and his voice behind her, patient as stone, telling her what she had missed and why. She felt the space between heartbeats. She watched the grass at 800 yards go still. She moved her finger from the guard to the trigger. She breathed out. She found the bottom of the exhale. She found the silence that lived inside the silence. She squeezed the trigger the way her father had taught her to squeeze it since she was 12 years old. Not as an action, as a disappearance. Let the trigger be surprised. The shot that flinches is the one where you thought about it too hard. The Barrett fired. 30 people felt it in their chests, even through the suppressor. The bullet was in the air for 4 seconds, 2,500 yards, dropping over 110 feet in its arc, correcting for every invisible force in the sky between her and that steel plate. Nobody breathed. Then the sound came back. Bright, clean. The unmistakable ring of a .50 caliber round hitting steel dead center at 2,500 yards. The range came apart. Men who had spent careers training themselves out of visible, emotional reaction, who had stood in places far worse than this and held themselves together through professional discipline alone, shouted. Someone's hat went airborne. 3 phones swung simultaneously toward Sloane's face, which was completely still, the stillness of a nervous system registering something enormous and not yet finished processing it. She stayed behind the rifle for 1 more second, with her eyes still at the scope. Then she rose. She stood. She brushed the desert dust from her father's jacket. Holt walked toward her. He walked the way men walk when they are revising their understanding of the world as they move. Not in defeat, not in anger, but in the deliberate recalibration of someone who has found a landmark that was not on his map and is updating his chart in real time. He stopped 3 feet away and extended his hand. His voice, when he spoke, had lost every trace of what had been in it that morning. "Who are you?" he said. Not the dismissal wrapped in a question, the real version. The question of a man who understood that the answer had just become the most important information in the room. Sloane looked at his hand, then she shook it. "Thomas Avery's daughter," she said. "He taught me everything." The name landed differently than she expected. Something moved behind Holt's eyes, quick, deep, the current of a man who recognized something he had not anticipated recognizing. But it was the man against the far wall who moved first. He had been there since before Sloane arrived, standing with that particular stillness, watching the entire morning with a quality of attention she had not been able to name until this moment. He was late 60s, lean, a face worn down not by age, but by the friction of a certain kind of life lived fully and at cost. He was walking toward her now with the economy of movement of someone for whom every step had long been chosen deliberately. He stopped 2 feet away. He looked at her for a moment without speaking, the way people look when they are choosing exactly the right words for something that will not survive the wrong ones. "Your father sent me," he said, not a greeting, a fact being delivered. Sloane felt something cold move through her chest. "Technically," the man said, "he sent me 4 years ago." He paused, and when he spoke again, it was with the steady, level voice of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for a long time. "I've been waiting for you to be ready." "Ready for what?" she said. The man glanced at the phones, at the 30 men watching, at Holt, who gave him a very slight nod that Sloane could not quite read. "There's something you need to know," the man said, keeping his voice low, "about who your father really was, about what he left behind." He stopped, "And about what happened to him." Sloane's father had died of a heart attack. That was what the death certificate said. That was what the coroner had told her gently over the phone on a Tuesday morning in March of 2021, while she was standing in the parking lot of the school between second and third period, and the world had quietly and completely ceased to be the place it had been 2 minutes before. Cardiac arrest, natural causes, 63 years old. She had never questioned it, not once in 4 years. "My father died of a heart attack," she said. The man's expression did not change. It had already been set to something that was not agreement and not contradiction, but was instead the careful face of someone who had been waiting for exactly those words. "That's what they made it look like," he said. Behind her, Holt spoke, his voice stripped down to pure operational clarity. "We need to get off this range," he said, "right now." Sloane looked at the man in front of her. the careful blue of his eyes. The weight he was carrying, the loaded weight of someone who has been holding a secret for someone who is no longer alive to keep it themselves. "Who are you?" she said. "Warren Dolan," he said. "Sergeant Major, retired. I served with your father for 16 years. She looked at his face. She looked at what was behind his face. "What happened to my father?" she asked. Warren Dolan held her gaze for a long, steady moment. "Everything," he said. "Everything happened. And it started 15 years before he died." He glanced at the phones one more time, at the men who had just watched her break a record on camera, in front of witnesses, footage that would be online before noon. "And now that you've gone viral," he said, "the people who killed him know exactly where you are." Sloane Avery stood in the desert morning light with her father's rifle in her hands and her father's jacket on her shoulders. 31 men behind her. A stranger in front of her with 16 years of something he had been carrying alone. And the absolute understanding, arriving quietly and completely, that the shot she had just fired was not the moment that changed everything. The moment that changed everything was the moment 2 nights ago when she had opened her mouth at a bar in Coronado and said 4 words she could not take back. "My father shot farther." She had thought those words were about a bet, about money she needed and a record she knew was real, and a man who needed to hear the truth. She had not understood yet what those words had actually started. She was beginning to understand now. They didn't speak until the doors were closed and the windows were up, and Warren had pulled out of the Camp Pendleton parking lot at a speed that looked like nothing. That was the point. Urgency is visible. A man driving normally is invisible. Warren Dolan had spent 4 decades understanding the difference. Sloane sat in the back seat with the Barrett case across her lap, still warm from the range, still carrying the smell of gun oil and fired brass. Holt was in the passenger seat. He had stopped watching the mirrors after the first 2 miles, which meant either they were clear or he had decided it didn't matter for the moment. She wasn't sure which. "Tell me," she said. Warren drove and he talked. Operation Mountain Lion, August 2008, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. 6 men, clean intelligence, a high-value target named in the mission brief, standard parameters, the kind of operation that Thomas Avery had run 30 times before, in places with different names and the same fundamental geometry. They found the target, but before they found him, they found something else. 3 Americans, a covered flatbed truck, a transaction happening in the middle of a compound in eastern Afghanistan that had no explanation that held up to a second look. The company was called Horizon Defense Solutions. They had Department of Defense logistics contracts, which meant they had legal standing to be anywhere in the theater, which meant nobody questioned their presence. They were part of the landscape. Background noise. Thomas Avery was not a man who accepted background noise without examining it first. He and a 23-year-old communications specialist named Cal Bridger watched the compound for 48 hours. Cal was from a small town in East Texas, the kind of young man who had grown up fixing things with his hands and figured out somewhere along the way that he had a mind built for systems, for seeing how pieces connected, for finding the seam in a structure and knowing exactly where to press. He was the best at what he did. Thomas had said so in writing, twice. Cal cloned a laptop. It took him 11 minutes. What they found on that laptop was not complicated to understand. It was only complicated to believe. $930 million in fraudulent defense contracts. Weapons moving from American military supply chains to Taliban-affiliated forces. Opium moving back in the other direction. A cycle that fed itself, that needed the war to continue in order to keep generating what it generated. Every weapon that crossed that line killed people. Some of those people were American soldiers. They filed a clean mission report. Target neutralized. Nothing unusual observed. Thomas Avery was smart enough to understand that reporting through normal channels meant reporting to people who might already be connected to Horizon. He smuggled the evidence out separately, a hard drive, a dead drop, A contact who could hold it safely while he decided what came next. Then he waited. He didn't wait long before the waiting stopped feeling like strategy and started feeling like survival. Cal Bridger. Vehicle accident in Kunar Province. November 2008. The vehicle burned. Identification through dental records. Nobody questioned it. Warren said the name the way you say the name of someone young who should not be dead. Staff Sergeant Owen Farrell. Friendly fire during a training exercise. March 2009. Investigation concluded. Tragic mistake. Corporal Reed Calloway. Apparent suicide. 2010. No note. His wife told investigators he had been the happiest she had seen him in years. He had submitted his re-enlistment paperwork 3 weeks before he died. Specialist Roy Maddox. Single vehicle accident on base. Straight road, clear weather, daylight, no skid marks. The truck was quiet between each name. The silence was not empty. It was the silence of a particular kind of grief. The kind that comes not from loss alone, but from understanding what the loss meant and who had decided it. 4 men, Holt said. His voice was low. 4 men, Warren confirmed. 4 years, all investigated and closed. And by 2012, it was just your father and me. 2 out of 6. And we both understood by then that the statistical probability of what had happened was so low, it was essentially a message. It was telling us that someone knew who had been in that compound, and that someone was working through a list. Sloane's hands were flat on the rifle case in her lap. She was watching them carefully, making sure they were not shaking. They were not shaking. "What did you do?" she said. "We disappeared," Warren said. "Not physically. We disappeared from their radar. No digital communication. Dead drops only. Your father retired, bought his land in West Texas, became exactly the man he appeared to be. A veteran who had made his peace and wanted nothing from anyone. He looked at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes the color of someone who has learned to carry weight without letting it show in his face. For 12 years, he said, your father lived that life, taught you, kept the land, kept the evidence in a place no one would think to look, and kept his silence the way a man keeps something he knows is temporary, because he always knew it was temporary. He was not hiding forever. He was waiting for the moment to be right. Sloane thought about the mornings, the Texas mornings, cold and dark, her breath visible. Her father handing her coffee without a word, and then standing behind her at the bench with his hands in his pockets and his eyes on the distant target. Patient in a way that had seemed effortless when she was young, and now, hearing this, revealed itself as something else entirely. Not effortlessness, discipline. The discipline of a man who had been living 2 lives simultaneously for over a decade and had never once let the weight of it enter his voice when he was teaching her. Read the flags first, he had said, then the grass, then trust the math. She had thought she understood what those mornings were about. She thought she had understood the whole thing. She had been incomplete. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She looked at it, looked at Warren in the mirror. He gave her a single, small nod. She answered. The voice on the other end was male, mid-60s, carrying the texture of absolute authority that comes not from volume, but from decades of never having been told no by anyone who mattered. Unhurried, almost pleasant, the voice of a man conducting a business call. Miss Avery, congratulations on the record. The video is extraordinary. I've watched it 3 times this morning. I think we should speak before this moves any further. Sloane said nothing. She looked out the window at the passing scrubland and kept her face completely still. I know you're in a vehicle heading north on the 215, the voice said. I know Warren Dolan is driving. I know your daughter Lily is currently 3 blocks from her school. He paused, not for effect, just the natural pause of a man reading from information in front of him. None of this is a threat, Miss Avery. It's simply context. I prefer honest conversations. Sloane said one word. Who? My name is Conrad Mercer. I believe we have some mutual history to discuss. She held the phone for 2 more seconds. Then she ended the call. Warren's hands had tightened on the wheel by a fraction. Holt had turned in his seat. "He knew exactly where we are," she said. "He knew Lily's location. He said it was context." Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said the things she already knew he was going to say. "He's been watching since this morning." Since the range video started spreading, Holt looked at her steadily. Did he threaten her directly? No, he was careful. "He's always careful," Warren said. In an office building in McLean, Virginia, at that same moment, Conrad Mercer set his phone face down on the desk and turned his chair to face the window in the gray Potomac below it. He was 64 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the physical stillness of a man who had not been surprised by anything in a very long time. He wore no uniform. He had not worn a uniform in 22 years. The authority lived differently in him now, sewn into the way he occupied a room, the way he occupied space itself. He turned to the man standing near the door. "Move the El Cajon surveillance team to active watch," he said. "Don't enter the unit. Don't touch anything inside it. Just watch." "Sir," "and pull everything we have on Thomas Avery's property holdings in New Mexico." He paused. "All of them, including the ones he bought under the LLC." He looked back at the window, at the video still playing on the screen behind him. Sloane Avery rising from behind the Barrett, brushing desert dust from her father's jacket. "Ghost's daughter," he said quietly. "He really did teach her everything." He said it without anger, without alarm, with the measured consideration of a man cataloging a new variable and deciding where it fit in his existing understanding of a situation he believed he controlled. He had handled 6 problems larger than this one in his career. He would handle this one the same way. Patience, precision, no fingerprints. They reached the storage unit in El Cajon at 2 in the afternoon. Warren parked a block away and watched the street for 4 minutes before he said anything. The black SUV that had been sitting on the east side of the facility when they arrived was no longer there. That was not reassurance. That was information. Sloane went in alone. Holt and Warren stayed at the entrance. Some spaces belonged to one person, and both men understood this without it needing to be said. Unit 114. She had the key on the same ring as her car keys, the way you keep something close, not because you think about it every day, but because some part of you knows it belongs within reach. She lifted the roll door and stood at the threshold for exactly 3 seconds, and then she walked in. The metal case was where it had always been, at the back against the left wall. Olive drab, military specification, combination lock, and a strip of white athletic tape along the top edge with her name written in her father's handwriting. She had opened it once before, the week after the funeral, standing in this same fluorescent light, in a state of grief so total that she had read the letter twice without understanding it, and closed everything back up and driven home and not returned. She opened the combination lock now. The letter was on top. Below it, nested in custom foam cut to exact dimensions, the hard drive. Military grade, vacuum sealed, the kind of packaging engineered to survive flood and fire and time. She picked up the letter. "When you're ready, come back. Remember what I taught you. Shooting isn't about the rifle. It's about understanding invisible forces, the ones you can see if you've learned to look. Distance, wind, time, patience. The space between intention and result. Everything you need is in everything I taught you. The shot that started everything is the key to what ends it." She read it a 3rd time, a 4th. And now, standing here with Warren's voice still present in her head, with Cal Bridger's name and Owen Farrell's name and Reed Calloway's name and Roy Maddox's name sitting in her chest like stones, the letter stopped being a letter and became a set of instructions she had simply lacked the key to read. The shot that started everything, the mountain lion shot. Her father's longest confirmed distance from a field exercise in New Mexico, 2009. 2,512 yards. 14-degree bearing from a GPS coordinate he had used as a fixed reference point since their first New Mexico exercise that same year. She had never asked why he always returned to the same ground. 20 acres along Lincoln National Forest, purchased quietly in 2012 under an LLC whose name she had never thought to look up. He had been building toward this for longer than she had understood. The coordinate existed before the land did. He had found the place first, then made it his. He had encoded the location in the one place no one could search, inside his daughter's memory, inside decades of navigation exercises that always used her mother's birthday, August 14th, as the reference bearing. True North. He had called it that every single time, year after year, until the phrase lived in her nervous system at a level below conscious thought. It was not metaphor. It had never been metaphor. She folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, against her chest. She picked up the hard drive and carried it to Holt at the entrance. "Don't let this out of your hands," she said. He took it without a word and put it inside his jacket. Back in the truck, Warren already on his phone, the old model, the kind that made calls and nothing else. "We have a problem," he said. Holt said, "How big?" "The SUV that was parked outside this facility when we pulled in. It was here before we arrived. They've had this unit under passive surveillance since 2021. Sloan felt the cold move through her again. "If they knew about the unit," she said, "why didn't they take what was inside it?" "Because taking it creates evidence," Warren said. "Mercer has spent 15 years making problems disappear without leaving fingerprints. A forced entry on a storage unit with chain of custody leading back to Ghost Avery's family is a thread. He doesn't pull threads. He waits for people to hand him what he needs. He was waiting for me to come back and get it myself," Sloan said. "And then follow you to wherever you took it," Warren said, "and collect it cleanly." They drove. Warren took back roads south and then east, routes that traded speed for invisibility. Sloan called Lily. "Stay at Brennan's tonight," she said. "If anyone contacts you, anyone you don't recognize, you call me immediately." Lily heard something in her mother's voice and did not ask questions. Sloan held the phone for a moment after she hung up and then put it in her pocket. They crossed into New Mexico well after dark. At a gas station outside Silver City, Warren spread a hand-drawn map across the hood of the truck. GPS coordinates to the property boundary. Sloan did the bearing calculation in her head. Her mother's birthday, 14 degrees, true north, always. 2,512 yards from the eastern fence post. "Creek Junction," Holt said, looking at his mapping application. "Limestone outcropping beside a dry wash." "He'd use a natural landmark," Warren said, "something that doesn't move. He used the Posada River bend for our first navigation exercise in this area," Sloan said. "He told me natural features are more reliable than anything men build. Men move things. The river stays." She put her finger on the end point on the map and felt with absolute certainty that she was right. Not the mathematical certainty of a calculated shot, the deeper certainty of knowing someone well enough to know how they think. They left the vehicles at a trailhead 5 miles from the coordinates and moved the rest of the way on foot. Warren had gear in the truck bed organized with practiced economy, rifles, night vision, water, first aid. He distributed it without ceremony. Holt checked his equipment once, fast, and moved. Sloan slung the Remington 700 over her shoulder and felt the familiar geometry of her father's modifications settle against her hands, and she moved. They had been walking for 40 minutes when Warren raised his fist. Through the night vision goggles, in the clearing below the limestone outcropping, Sloan saw them. 8 men in dark clothing moving in practice patterns across the 20 acres, working outward from a central point in a systematic grid. 3 holes already opened. Professional. The search pattern of people who were very good at finding things. 30 meters from the correct location. Holt assessed the situation in under 10 seconds. Warren pointed to the ridgeline, then to Sloan, then to the high ground. She understood. Elevation. Clear sight lines. She moved wide, Belly crawled the last 20 yards through dry grass, settled behind a fallen ponderosa, and found the clearing in her scope. Below, Warren and Holt moved through the tree line toward the limestone. Slow, deliberate. 8 contractors between them and the objective, none looking in the right direction. She tracked the men in the clearing, identified the 2 with the widest peripheral vision, kept her crosshairs moving between them, steady, unhurried. Fear is just information, her father's voice said from somewhere in the part of her memory that stored everything he had ever told her. Respect it. Don't let it vote. Warren reached the limestone. He pulled the folding entrenching tool from his pack and began to dig. Quiet, methodical, slower than she wanted. One of the contractors turned his head, and her crosshair settled on center mass, and she held it there, breath even, waiting. The contractor was looking at something in the brush to the north. He turned back. Warren's hand went into the hole and came back holding a waterproof military case. He held it up briefly. Even through the night vision at this distance, she could see what was in his face. The complicated relief of a man retrieving something that had cost more than it should have cost anyone. Then the floodlights came on, 4 of them blazing from 3 directions simultaneously. Night vision became blindness in an instant. She ripped the goggles away and blinked against white light that turned everything flat and overexposed and without depth. A bullhorn. The voice on it was flat, authoritative, and completely certain. Sergeant Dolan, set down the case, hands on your heads. You are surrounded by 12 contractors with direct fire authority. Comply immediately. Not 8, 12. The others had been waiting, hidden, letting them do the work. Miss Avery, the bullhorn again. We know you're on the ridgeline. Thermal imaging shows your position clearly. Set down the rifle. Come down from the high ground. You have 10 seconds before we begin shooting your colleagues. She looked toward the clearing. Holt was blinded by the lights, but he found her anyway. The instinct of a man who reads spaces as naturally as breathing. He shook his head. One word, mouthed clearly. Run. Warren shook his head. Same word. 10, 9, 8. She stood up. She stepped out of the tree line with the rifle lowered and her hands clearly visible, and she walked down from the ridgeline into the white light, feeling with each step the sensation of walking directly into something whose shape she could not yet see, but whose weight she could already feel. Don't shoot, she said. I'm coming down. Conrad Mercer stepped out of the dark behind the lights. She recognized him before she recognized his face. Something in the way he moved. The absolute ease of a man who had never genuinely considered the possibility of consequences. He wore tactical outdoor clothing that had never been near actual field conditions. He looked at her with the calm, measuring attention of a collector examining something he had already decided to acquire. Ghost Avery's daughter, he said. You have his eyes. A contractor brought the waterproof case forward. Mercer opened it with the careful deliberation of a man unwrapping something he had been looking for a long time. He held up the hard drive. $930 million, he said. 460 gigabytes. 5 consecutive life sentences under current federal statute. He put it in his jacket pocket. Fortunately, he said, it will never be introduced into evidence by anyone. You murdered my father, Sloan said. I resolved a threat to ongoing operations. His tone did not change. Not defensive, not cruel, simply factual. The tone of a man who has never needed to justify himself to anyone who mattered. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 12 years sitting on evidence with the patience of a man who intended eventually to use it. I admired his patience, Mercer said. I had almost convinced myself he had made peace with it. He made peace with nothing, Holt said from across the clearing. Mercer looked at all 3 of them with the surveying patience of a man who has already decided the ending and is simply being courteous about the timing. Then he offered it. $1.8 million each, wired within 6 hours, signed agreements, long and comfortable lives. He let that sit for a moment, or the alternative. The clearing was silent. 12 rifles, no cell service, no one who knew they were here. Sloane's mind was running on a separate track, the way it ran during a long shot. Multiple calculations simultaneously, none fully conscious, all feeding toward a single point. The drive was in his pocket. She had no play on the drive, but there was one thing Mercer did not know. Destroy it, she said. The word was quiet, completely level. Everyone looked at her. Destroy the drive, she said again. Burn it, smash it. It doesn't matter, because it's not the only copy. Something moved behind Mercer's eyes. Quick, involuntary. He controlled it in under a second, but she had seen it. She had been reading faces across bar counters for 2 years, and she had been reading her father's face for 37 years, and she knew exactly what involuntary looked like. Your father sat on one copy for 16 years, Mercer said carefully. That suggests a man who trusted exactly one archive. Or, Sloane said, it suggests a man who was waiting until his daughter was ready, waiting until there was someone who could finish it correctly. She took one step toward him. Fort Bragg, Holt said from behind her. His voice was immediate, certain, no space between her move and his. First National Bank on Bragg Boulevard. Safe deposit box held by my father, Earl Holt, since 2020. Thomas Avery gave it to him directly and told him never to open it and never to surrender it to anyone except me or Sloane Avery. Mercer looked at Holt for a long moment. Then he turned to the contractor nearest him and spoke quietly. A laptop appeared, a satellite connection established. 2 minutes of silence in the white light. Then the contractor looked up with the gray expression of someone delivering the one piece of news their employer did not want to receive. Sir, he said, box registered to hold at that branch. Active since 2020. The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it. This was the silence of absolute certainty meeting an edge it did not know was there. Mercer looked at Sloane. For the first time since he had walked out of the dark, the ease in his face had something beneath it. Not fear. Men like Mercer did not do fear in any simple sense, but its functional equivalent. The controlled alertness of a man who has just discovered he is not holding all the cards he believed he was holding. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, fourth option. And Sloane understood that the real negotiation had just begun. Mutual deterrence, Mercer said. You establish a verifiable dead man switch. Something I can confirm is real. We both stand down. Neither side moves. The arrangement that kept my father quiet for 12 years until you killed him anyway, Warren said. Mercer's expression remained unchanged. Thomas was not a man who could stay still forever, he said. He made contact with people he should not have contacted. He changed the terms without my agreement. He looked back at Sloane with the steady precision of a man making a final calculation. You are not your father, he said. You are younger. You have more future to protect. His eyes moved to her face with a deliberateness that made something tighten in her chest. Your daughter Lily, he said, 17, wants to study veterinary medicine. UC Davis is her first choice. Lily's name in his mouth was the most violent thing that had happened all night. More violent than the floodlights, more violent than the 12 rifles. He had said it the way you say the name of something you could reach for whenever you chose. Sloane did not move. She did not let her face do anything he could read or use. Her father's voice, arriving from the part of her that would always be standing behind a bench in West Texas at 5 in the morning with her breath visible in the cold. The shot that misses is almost always the one where you rushed. Slow down when everything tells you to speed up. She slowed down. 1 week, Mercer said. Establish the switch. Demonstrate it is functional. And then we both step back. He held her gaze one final moment. Your father was a better man than I am, he said. He died for it. I hope you are smarter than he was. He turned. His contractors followed. The floodlights went out in sequence, left to right, like a curtain dropping, and the clearing was dark again, and the New Mexico night came back in around the three of them, cold and enormous, and indifferent to everything that had just happened inside it. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Warren moved toward the waterproof case that Mercer had dropped in the clearing. Empty now, the hard drive gone, but in a small internal pocket, his fingers finding it in the dark, a folded piece of paper. Her father's handwriting, 3 lines, written in the last months of his life, the ink still dark and deliberate. If they found this first, the drive is gone. But the truth isn't. The investigator's name is Dana Prescott, Senate Armed Services Committee. She has been building the file for 3 years. She needs the thread. You are the thread. Warren read it, his jaw tightened. Then he did something Sloane had not seen him do once in all the hours she had known him. He closed his eyes for 3 full seconds. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the darkness around them. He planned for this, Holt said quietly. He planned for every scenario, Sloane said. She looked at the note in Warren's hand. Her father's handwriting, steady and clean, written when he knew what was coming and chose to keep building anyway. He used to run me through field exercises where everything went wrong at step 2, and then ask me what I would do at step 8. She stopped. I hated those exercises, she said. She looked at the limestone outcropping above them, solid and permanent, and exactly where it had always been, where the river had put it and left it 10,000 years ago, and where it would remain long after everything that had happened tonight was settled. I didn't understand why until tonight. They drove through the New Mexico night and they planned. Not the way people plan in movies, cleanly and with certainty, each piece falling into place with the satisfying logic of a story that already knows its ending. They plan the way real people plan when the stakes are absolute and the margin for error is 0. By saying the true thing even when it was inconvenient, by pushing back when something didn't hold, by trusting that the person across from them was smarter in certain ways and deferring accordingly without making it into something it didn't need to be. Warren drove. Holt sat in the passenger seat with his phone and his contacts and the operational clarity of a man who understood that the next 72 hours were the hours that determined everything that came after. Sloane sat in the back with her father's jacket pulled close, and the New Mexico dark moving past the window, and her mind running the way it ran on a long shot. Patient and sequential, following the logic of known variables toward their inevitable endpoint. Mercer had given them 1 week. That meant they had less than 1 week. Warren had said it plainly in the clearing, and it was true. 1 week meant until Mercer decided they were more useful dead than contained. The mutual deterrence he had proposed was not a truce. It was a clock. They needed to build something real, something that made eliminating them genuinely more dangerous than leaving them alone. Not just the dead man's switch as a concept, but the actual architecture of it. Lawyers and documents and encrypted channels and multiple people holding enough of the truth that even if all 3 of them disappeared tonight, the story still had a path forward. That was what her father had been building toward. He had simply run out of time before he could finish it. They were going to finish it for him. Warren had a lawyer in Phoenix named Garrison Webb, a former JAG officer who had spent 30 years in military and federal law and owed Warren the kind of favor that cannot be repaid with money. Garrison would build the legal structure. 7 documents across 4 attorneys in 3 different states, none of whom would know the full picture, each holding a piece that only made complete sense when assembled. The assembly would happen automatically on a timer if the check-in protocol went unanswered for 72 hours. Holt had 2 journalists, a woman at the Washington Post who had broken 3 defense contractor stories in the past decade, a man at ProPublica who had spent 15 years doing exactly this category of work. He had been an anonymous source for both of them in different contexts over the years, which meant there was trust already built. The kind of trust that doesn't require explanation when you call at 2 in the morning. He called them both from the truck. Each call was brief. Each said the same thing in different words. I have something significant. I'm not ready to give it to you yet, but if I stop checking in, you open the envelope. Both said yes without hesitation. The immediate yes of people who had been waiting for exactly this kind of call, for exactly this kind of story. The deposit box at Fort Bragg was real. Holt's father, Earl Holt, a retired Army warrant officer from Georgia, a man of profound stubbornness and absolute reliability, had been holding a package for Thomas Avery since 2020. He had never opened it. He had never asked what was inside. A man he respected had asked him to hold it, and that had been sufficient, because some men are still built that way, and Earl Holt was one of them. Holt called him at 2:30 in the morning. Dad, he said, I need you to go to that box first thing tomorrow. Don't open it, just confirm it's there and call me back. A long pause on the line. Then his father's voice, low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had not been surprised by a late phone call in 40 years of service life. Is this about what I think it's about? Yes. Is my son about to end up in a newspaper? Probably. Another pause. Then, I'll be at the bank when it opens. He didn't ask why. He didn't need anything else. Some men give you their trust completely or not at all. And Earl Holt had decided long ago which kind of man he was going to be. By 4 in the morning, they had the architecture roughed in. Not complete. The completeness would take 10 days. The coordination of lawyers and documents and encrypted accounts across multiple time zones. But structurally sound, strong enough that Mercer, if he ran a serious risk assessment, would conclude that moving against them carried more legal and institutional exposure than the alternative. He had offered them mutual deterrence. They were going to build it so well it became a cage. Sloan called Lily at 6:30 when she knew her daughter would be awake for her morning run. I'm okay, she said before Lily could ask. I'm safe. I'll be home tonight. Mom, Lily said, there are journalists calling the school. Mr. Patterson said 2 people called the front office yesterday afternoon. Don't talk to anyone. Tell Mr. Patterson that. Tell Brennan's parents that. No one. What is actually happening? Sloan thought about how to answer this. She thought about Cal Bridger's mother, wherever she was in East Texas, who had spent 17 years not knowing what her son had died for. She thought about Roy Maddox's daughter, 12 years old, being raised by a mother who had been handed a grief with no explanation attached to it. It's about your grandfather, she said. It's about making sure people know who he really was and what he really did. She stopped. And it's about making sure the people who heard him have to answer for it. A silence on the line. Then Lily said, quietly and without hesitation, he was the best man I ever knew. Do it, whatever it takes. She was 17 years old and she sounded in that moment like her grandfather. The same directness, the same refusal to look away from the necessary thing. Sloan felt the pride that has no easy name, the pride of a parent watching their child reveal who they are in a moment that demands it. Love you, she said. Come home safe, Lily said. Then tell me everything. The 10 days that followed were the most disciplined 10 days of Sloan Avery's life. And that was saying something, because she had spent 31 years learning discipline from a man who treated it as a form of love. Garrison Webb had the legal architecture finalized by day 3. 7 documents, 4 attorneys across 3 states, each holding a piece structured so the pieces only made complete sense when assembled, which would happen automatically on a 72-hour timer if check-in protocol went unanswered. Holt's contacts at the Post and ProPublica each received sealed envelopes through private couriers on day 4. Not the full evidence, not the complete story. Enough. A directory structure, a list of names, wire transfer reference numbers from 2008 and 2009. The kind of precise, verifiable detail that an experienced journalist recognizes immediately as real, because it is too specific and too unglamorous to be invented. Both journalists called Holt within 2 hours of receiving their envelopes. Both said the same thing in different words. When you're ready, we're ready. Dana Prescott, at the Senate Armed Services Committee, moved quietly and fast in the way people move when they have been waiting for something for a long time, and it has finally arrived. She did not contact Sloan directly. She did not need to. What Sloan understood through Warren's careful, measured updates was that Prescott had been building a parallel file on Apex Global Security for 31 months. Different sources, different angles, the same corruption viewed from across the room. What Ghost Avery's daughter represented was not a case handed to her fully formed. It was the final piece that made her own existing case actionable. Prescott had the context. Sloan had the proof. Together, they had something federal prosecutors could work with. On day 7, Mercer sent a letter. Not a text, not a call, a physical letter delivered to Sloan's school address, which meant he had people inside the San Diego Unified School District's administrative system, which meant his reach was wider and more casual than even Warren had estimated. The letter was 2 sentences, written in the bloodless, formal language of corporate legal correspondence. We trust the arrangement is proceeding as discussed. Please confirm readiness by end of week. Sloan read it twice. Then she walked to her second period AP calculus class and taught a lesson on related rates. How 2 variables can change simultaneously. How the rate of one determines the rate of the other. How everything in a moving system is connected to everything else. She thought, while her students worked through practice problems in quiet focus, that her father would have appreciated the particular irony of this. That evening, she sent Mercer 3 words through the protocol Warren had established. Infrastructure is complete. She did not mention that complete had a different meaning than Mercer understood. That complete meant every piece was in place. That complete meant they were not standing down. That complete meant they were pulling the thread. On day 8, Mercer called again. She answered. Your father was patient for 12 years, Miss Avery, he said. You know how that ended. She looked out the kitchen window at the street below. Holt was sitting across from her at the table. He could hear both sides of the call. He did not move. He was patient because he was building something that would outlast him, she said. So am I. She ended the call. Holt looked at her for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Then he said, simply and without elaboration, You sound exactly like him. It was the first time since the morning at Camp Pendleton that Sloan allowed herself to smile. Not the controlled expression of someone managing their face, a real one, brief, but real. They had work to do. The congressional inquiry became public on a Tuesday morning, 17 months after the night in the New Mexico clearing. Not because Sloan, or Holt, or Warren triggered anything directly, because Dana Prescott had spent those 17 months doing what she had always been doing, building from 31 months of her own work and 3 years of parallel files and the specific actionable thread that Ghost Avery's daughter had handed her, until the case was structurally sound enough to survive what investigations into powerful men always face. The sustained, well-funded pressure of people who do not want to be investigated. The first subpoenas went out on a Tuesday. By Thursday, 2 former Horizon contractors had accepted cooperation agreements. By the following Monday, a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense had taken early retirement. By the end of the month, 3 current Apex Global Security contracts were suspended pending review. Warren called Sloan on a Wednesday morning. She was standing in the school parking lot between classes, the same parking lot where she had stood 4 years ago and learned her father was dead. The symmetry of it was not something she had planned. It was just the shape the world had taken. Mercer made a mistake, Warren said, and his voice held something she had not heard in it before. Not relief exactly, but the sound of a man who has waited long enough to watch the right thing finally happen. After the inquiry went public, he authorized a surveillance team on you. Physical surveillance, photographs, movement logs. One of his contractors, a man named Aldrich, documented every order Mercer gave personally, kept copies off-site, built himself an insurance policy. Warren paused. Aldrich walked into the FBI field office in Arlington 4 days ago and handed them a folder. Direct chain of command. Mercer's voice on 2 recorded calls authorizing the operation. He paused again, and when he continued, his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it. It's over, Sloan. Not because of what we built, because of what he couldn't stop himself from doing. Your father wrote it in that last note. Arrogance is the longest-range weakness any man can carry. He was right. Mercer aimed at you and hit himself. Sloan leaned against the hood of her car. The transmission was finally fixed. It had been quiet for 3 months. She had almost stopped noticing. Something moved through her that she could not immediately name. It was not triumph. Triumph was too clean, too simple, too much about the person feeling it. What she felt was older than triumph and heavier. The feeling of something that has been wrong for a very long time, beginning finally to become right. DOJ is moving, Warren said. FBI has the full file. We've been asked to come in, she called Holt. He picked up on the first ring. I heard, he said. Thursday? Thursday, she said. A pause. Then, in a voice she had not heard from him before, the voice underneath the operational clarity, the voice of a man who had watched something begin at a bar in Coronado and chosen to follow it all the way to where it led. Your father knew it would take this long, he said. He knew exactly how much patience it required. He was right about you, about everything. She didn't have words for that. She didn't try to find any. Thursday, she said again. They hung up and carried what they were carrying in their own separate silences. The conference room at the DOJ field office was fluorescent and unremarkable and smelled like old carpet and fresh coffee. Sloan sat at the table for 6 hours and answered every question that 2 federal prosecutors, a Senate committee investigator, and 2 FBI agents asked her. She answered them the way her father had taught her to shoot, with complete accuracy, without decoration, trusting that the truth told plainly was more powerful than the truth told impressively. At the end of 6 hours, they drove to a secure evidence facility and watched a forensic technician open a waterproof case retrieved from a home safe in McLean, Virginia, following the execution of a federal search warrant that morning. The hard drive was intact. Of course it was. Conrad Mercer was not a man who destroyed leverage. He was a man who stored it, who understood that information was currency, who had held the drive for 17 months, believing it gave him control of the situation. He had not understood, could not have understood, because understanding it would have required knowing Ghost Avery's daughter in a way he had not bothered to, that the situation had never been in his control. Not from the moment Sloan walked into the white light in the New Mexico clearing with her hands visible and nothing to lose except the thing she refused to lose. Not from the moment she opened her mouth in a bar in Coronado and said 4 words she had no practical reason to say. Not from the moment 48 hours before that, when she had driven to a storage unit at midnight and stood at the threshold, and after 4 years of keeping everything closed, had walked in. The Senate hearing was on a Thursday in March. Sloan sat at the witness table with Warren on her left and Holt on her right. Behind them in the gallery, Earl Holt sat in the front row with the straight back of a man who had driven from Fort Bragg to watch something finish the way it was supposed to finish. Cal Bridger's mother was there from East Texas, in a good coat, with the searching eyes of a woman who had spent 17 years holding a grief she couldn't fully explain because she had never had all the pieces. Owen Farrell's widow, Reed Calloway's brother, Roy Maddox's wife and daughter, 12 years old, brought because her mother had decided she was old enough to be in the room when the truth came out about her father. The senior senator looked at Sloan over his reading glasses. Miss Avery, he said, can you confirm that Apex Global Security, formerly Horizon Defense Solutions, engaged in fraudulent defense contracts between 2008 and 2015? Yes, Senator. $930 million, fully documented. And the weapons transactions concurrent with those contracts? Concurrent with and financially interrelated. The contracts provided cover for the logistics network. They were the same operation. And the death of your father, Colonel Thomas Avery. She had been ready for this one for a long time. My father discovered the evidence in August 2008. He and 5 other operators spent 12 years in silence because they understood that the people responsible had sufficient resources to suppress any disclosure through conventional channels. 4 of those 6 men were killed in ways made to appear accidental. My father was killed in March of 2021 by injection of potassium chloride, administered to simulate cardiac arrest, because he had been approached and had refused payment to destroy the evidence. She kept her voice level, clear. Her father's daughter, entirely. Conrad Mercer told me this himself, she said, in a clearing in Lincoln National Forest in October of last year, in the presence of 2 witnesses. He was confident we would not survive to testify. The senator looked at her over his glasses. He told you directly. He was confident we would not survive to repeat it, she said. He was wrong about that. The ambient sound in the room changed. Not loud, the opposite of loud. The silence of a large number of people registering simultaneously that something has just become permanent. Outside the Russell Senate building afterward, Lily was there. She had flown from San Diego and missed 2 days of school and stood in the March light with her arm through her mother's arm, 17 years old, and looking in that moment like every generation of her family standing in a line behind her. Cal Bridger's mother took Sloane's hands in both of hers. She was small, and her eyes held the particular quality of someone who had been waiting a long time for something and was now finally holding it. He loved being a soldier, she said. He would have wanted this. He made it possible, Sloane said. He was 23 years old, and brilliant and brave, and this country let him down. I'm sorry it took this long. Don't be sorry, Cal's mother said, and her voice was firm. Be glad. We know now. Roy Maddox's daughter stood a few feet away, holding her mother's hand, watching with the still absorbing attention of a child who understands she is inside something important, even if she cannot yet name all of what it is. She caught Sloane's eye. My dad was a good man, she said, simply, as an established fact. He was exceptional, Sloane said. He was the reason the evidence survived. He was the reason all of this was possible. She held the girl's gaze. Remember that, always. Warren stood apart from the group, as he always stood apart, watching the street below the steps with the attention of a man who had spent 60 years watching streets. He looked different today, not smaller, lighter, like a person who had been carrying something for so long that their body had quietly reorganized itself around the weight. And now that the weight was gone, they were standing in their own original posture for the first time in years, and finding it unfamiliar and good. Holt stood beside Sloane. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then he said, "It's done." "Not done," she said. "Trial still to come. 2 years, maybe more." "For Mercer," he said. "For us, it's done." She thought about the distinction. The legal process would grind forward for years, with its subpoenas and depositions and defense motions, and the sustained expensive effort of powerful people who did not want to be held accountable. That process was not done. But the thing her father had started in a valley in Afghanistan in 2008, the thing that had cost 4 young men their lives, the thing he had carried alone for 12 years, and then entrusted to her across decades of cold mornings and patient lessons, in the form of love that builds instead of comforts, that thing was done. 6 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in September, Sloane drove to the cemetery outside San Antonio and sat beside her father's headstone for an hour in the late afternoon quiet. She told him about the trial date, which had been set for the following spring. She told him about Lily's acceptance to UC Davis, the first choice school, the one she had wanted since she was 14 years old. She told him about the 30 Marines she was currently teaching at Quantico, learning to read invisible forces in moving air, learning to trust the math and the patience and the space between intention and result. She told him about the morning 3 weeks ago when a 22-year-old Marine named Corporal Devin Hess had made his first clean hit at 1,500 yards without a calculator. The way he had stood up from the bench and said nothing for a long moment, just stared downrange at the distant steel plate, processing what his own hands had just done. She had recognized that silence. She had stood in it herself 30 years ago, with her father's hands in his pockets behind her and his voice patient as stone. She told Thomas Avery that she had understood, in that moment, exactly what he had felt watching her. She told him that the Wikipedia page still had the mountain lion shot wrong, that someone had edited it twice to correct it, and both times the correction had been reverted. She told him she had stopped caring about that. She sat with him for a while longer without speaking. The afternoon was warm, and the cemetery was quiet, and the light was doing what light does in September in Texas, going golden and long across the grass, making everything it touched look like something worth keeping. She stood up. She put her hand on the headstone for a moment. The stone was warm from the sun, solid, permanent in the way that only certain things are permanent, not because they do not change, but because what they mean does not. She picked up the Remington 700 and slung it over her shoulder. She walked back to her car. She had Marines to teach. She had a daughter starting college in the fall. She had a class the following morning on the only thing that had ever truly mattered. How to wait for the shot that mattered. How to read what you cannot see by watching everything it touches. How to find the space between your heartbeats when the moment finally arrives and the world goes quiet and all the years of patience and discipline and love converge on a single point. And how to make it count. Her father had taught her that. She had finished what he started. And the truth, patient and precise and built to last, had landed exactly where he always knew it would. Dead center,